Today and across the fence, agriculture is as American as apple pie. But when it comes to how to divide that pie for future generations, what's fair and what's equal? We'll look at a family farm and process of estate planning and making sure their business survives for the next generation. Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Keith Silva, in for Judy Simpson. We can't take it with us, but we can take the time to have difficult decisions about estate planning before our deaths, so we'll have peace of mind to know that our intentions are being followed. For farm families transferring ownership from one generation to the next, it's very complicated. Experts warn that if you don't have a plan for your farm business, don't worry, because the state of Vermont does. Across the Fence was in Cornwall to learn what one family has learned as they've been in the process of transferring their farm business.
Like many fathers and sons, Barney Hodges, Sr. and Jr., like to kid with one another.
The trees are supposed to be 4 feet, and then when I wasn't looking, Dad moved them to 5 feet over there.
Well, they were bigger trees.
They screwed the trees up for life.
The Hodges own and operate Sunrise Orchards in Cornwall. They grow apples on 200 acres and sell their entire crop wholesale. The packing line hums in the winter and spring, and by the time last year's crop is packed and shipped, the buds are on the trees and the process begins again. Sunrise Orchards was started by Hodges Sr. as a business partnership. When his partner left the day-to-day operations in 1994, Hodges was advised to change the business structure from a partnership to a corporation.
My accountant seemed to advise me that way, and I think it was probably a mistake at that time because we weren't making money. If you're making good money, then it's good to have a corporation, but if you're losing money, or you're better off without having a corporation.
Hodges was strictly a grower and had little control over the price he was paid for the crop.
When I planted the orchard, I sent all the apples down to the Shoreham Co-op. At harvest time, they stored them, they packed them out. All I had to do was wait for the money. And the money became kind of meager.
After a couple of successful off-farm careers, Barney Jr. returned to the farm in 1998 to find that the family business was failing.
When Barney wanted to come on board, I advised him not to at the time because financially we were having a hard time. We were struggling.
And I would say in 1998, this was not a viable business. So any type of successional planning is a moot point. When you don't have a viable business, it's not going to work. So at that point, the plan was, what's our exit strategy? And our exit strategy is liquidating the real estate. When the next generation gets involved, the ante is increased significantly because suddenly 2 families are needing to be supported rather than 1. And I looked at the business at that time, and there was no way that was going to happen doing what we were doing.
Faced with selling the farm, Barney Sr. gave his son his blessing, and Barney Jr. began selling apples out of the back of his station wagon. Over time, he built up clientele and drastically changed the business since coming on board in 1998.
Where we were a horizontally integrated business, we are now a vertically integrated business where we own our own storage, our own packing house, our own trucks. We sell much of our own fruit. We develop new relationships, completely changed the business.
Sunrise Orchards is 2 branches from the same tree. Barney Jr. and his wife Christiana own the corporation, which consists of the crop and the equipment. The real estate in the buildings are owned by Barney Sr. and his wife Pat. And now it's time to transfer those assets to the younger generation as well.
We need to invest in the infrastructure here. So far, every construction project has gone to increase the assets of my parents. And as long as they've been the primary owner of the corporation, that's been okay. But now we own the corporation, and we take on debt sometimes to build a building or make an improvement or put in a packing line, build a storage building. And whenever we're doing that, we're building the asset base of the estate, not of our own personal assets. It's not that we have a problem with that, but it just doesn't make sense to continue in that trajectory. So now we're working toward transferring real estate ownership, and that's a huge challenge. I have 2 older sisters, and we have to be open and clear and communicate as a family to try to figure that out.
What is unique about this farm is they're selling apples. They're not a dairy farm. They do a lot of direct retail selling. That's about where the uniqueness ends.
Bob Parsons, an agricultural economist with University of Vermont Extension, works with farm families on planning for a farm transfer. One of the biggest challenges in farm succession is determining what is fair and what is equal when it comes to children not involved in the farm business.
Splitting this farm up equally is not fair. But the hard decision then is, if equal is not fair, then what is fair? The best solution is one that it is not rushed, but discussed with the real practicalities of the implications of what it means for everybody, so that everybody gets their feelings on the table, and then somebody has to end up making a decision. The business is successful because of the land that it is using. If we change the ownership of the land and the control of that land different from what it is today, we may be killing the business. And that's something that the parents have to realize.
Talk this through in the bigger picture.
As co-owner of Sunrise Orchards Corporation, Christiana Hodges has a significant stake in the future of this farm business. For her, communication is key.
We have had many, many discussions with Barney's sisters and his mom and dad about, the different sort of ideas we have for how to take ownership of the farm and how to continue the farm in the future. And it has taken a really long time, but no one, I don't get the feeling that anyone is frustrated by that. I think people have come to a lot of conclusions over the last decade, and that's been really helpful. So being really patient, communicating, and I mean really deliberately, like in the form of surveys and face-to-face meetings, and just anytime you can get together and talk about it, it's really important.
Because ultimately, we all want everybody to be happy. But fair versus equal is somewhat subjective.
The Hodges believe their farm transfer will happen relatively soon. Sunrise Orchards is the Hodges family, and the Hodges family is Sunrise Orchards. For both to grow and thrive, it will take patience, communication, and understanding. And it doesn't hurt to have a little luck on your side either.
But having your son come in is a real blessing. I mean, I couldn't be luckier. If I didn't have a son coming in business, taking over the business, the farm would eventually be sold.
From father to son, and from one generation to the next, there's a lot on the horizon for Sunrise Orchards.
I'm joined by UVM Extension agricultural economist Bob Parsons. Good to see you again, Bob.
Thank you, Keith.
When we were visiting with the Hodges, what did you take away from our time with them, and what can you share with other farmers from that experience?
Well, they attacked the problem right out. I mean, they're talking among themselves. They already made the first transition. They've transitioned the business over from the older generation to the younger generation. So the Barney Jr. knows that he's actually running the business now. And now that he is actually running the business, he wants to know for his family's security, what about the real estate now? So now they're in discussing what is the most valuable part, but also probably one of the more complex parts, because he's now dealing with the inheritance of his sisters versus his, as well as for the lifetime security of his parents.
So be forthright, upfront, bull by the horns, start talking about this as soon as you can.
Well, if you don't talk about it, then you have suppressed feelings and you don't get anywhere. If you wait for dad to talk about it and you wait for son to talk about it, well, when is the right time? And for all too often in many families, the right time turns out to be the day after it's too late.
Right. As we said, it's important for that everyone needs to get their thoughts on the table. Who else needs to be at the table? Is this just for the family? Who else needs to be there?
It's primarily the family, but there's other people involved, because if there's debts on the land, you have to have the lender in with it. Mm-hmm. You probably usually need to bring an accountant in for it to understand the tax complexities that might be involved with any options of buying or selling or gifting. And so those two are almost essential and part of the argument.
The Hodges have been talking about this for a decade. It's all relative, but there is a clock on this process. As you said, so hopefully this discussion doesn't start a day after it's too late. What's the best case scenario here? How short can a farm transfer take?
Well, if everyone's in agreement and there's no debt on the property and we can say, well, the parents don't need any money, we'll just gift everything to the child, and that's well and good, and especially if the child's an only child. But that's rarely the circumstance. So you have multiple children to be involved with, and you have this fair versus equal issue with off-farm children. You have debts to be involved, and if there's debts, you can't just transfer a debt without Uncle Sam saying that there's a sale involved there somewhere. So there's all these complexities, and so then you have to do things legally because you're a corporation that has different rules than if you were an LLC, and so you need to be looking at the tax as well as the legal implications of any decision that you make.
Now, when you work with these farm transfers, Bob, and I've worked on enough of these stories with you to be extremely dangerous, you always say that making sure that you're going to those advisors, whether they're lawyers, accountants, whomever they are, and getting them involved in this. Mr. Hodges said, at the time I thought maybe that wasn't the right thing to do, or as I look back on it now, but having these advisors, you say, is key to this process.
Well, you need information. You can't make a decision, well, we're going to do this step, and then find out that there's some capital gains tax that has to be paid that you didn't know about. You need to be looking at the legal implications as well as the tax implications of every decision. And so you might have a decision that your lawyer might advise you to take, but your tax advisor says, I don't think that's a good one because you're going to be paying taxes. But that achieves what people want to do. And so you have to figure out where you want to end up and then work with your advisors and realize that they may not agree with things because the legal side may be different than the financial side whenever we're taking a look at the tax implications of any actions.
Is it all come down to taxes? Is that what it's really about in this, or is there more to it than just getting Uncle Sam getting his cut?
No, it's not all taxes. I mean, there's a way to minimize taxes, and there's ways to get around some of that. But it's also the flexibility. But there may be some tax things that you encounter that you can't get away from.
Right.
So those have to be taken care of, and you try to work around it the best way you can. And as you said, like Hodges said, they made a mistake, maybe possibly by becoming a corporation, but this was before LLCs were in place. Right. So maybe looking back on it now, it might have been a mistake at that time, but he made that decision with the best advice of his legal and financial advisors at that time.
Right, and that's what you always say. As Vermont farmers get older, Mr. Hodges is up in age, even Barney is we're all getting older. Is this one of the biggest issues facing ag business today?
Yes, today we have more farmers over age 65 than we have under 35. And with all the farm assets wrapped up in the hands of our elderly farmers, we do assume that most people do end up dying. And so that tells us in the next 20 years, we're going to have a lot of farm assets that are going to change hands, either planned or unplanned. And what we'd like to do is work with farmers so that that transfer is done in a planned process rather than an unplanned process.
You always talk about, and I mentioned in the opening about, if you don't have a plan, the state has a plan for you. This also applies to anyone else, not just farmers. Planning for the future, whether it's a will or anything like that, is very important.
Yeah, the majority of people die without a will. But the state of Vermont does have a will for you. So if you don't like the will that the state of Vermont has for you, then it's up to you to change your will so that you have done to your estate what you really want, your wishes,
your intentions,
to be carried out.
As we've got a couple of minutes left, what's the biggest issue that you want to make sure that farmers understand when they're planning a farm transfer? What's the biggest thing that comes up for you?
First off is just communication. All too often we get where two members of the farm family, the children are afraid to bring up the issue of mom and dad dying. How do you tactfully ask your parents what they're going to do with their estate after they die? And a lot of times the parents don't want to address the issue either. And for fear, a lot of times there's fear of, for the older generation, it goes their fear of outliving their assets. And with health care costs or nursing home care. And it's just an issue, it's a lot easier sometimes if we just kind of put it off till next year. But yet next year doesn't make it any easier.
Right.
It does require some communication to talk about what you would like done with the operation, because if what you want to happen is going to take a little bit of time to implement, you may not have that time to implement it.
Excellent advice. To learn more about the process of transferring the farm, visit uvm.edu/farm transfer. There you'll find information about workshops, video testimonials like you saw today, and links to help you get this important process started. I want to thank everybody here at WCAX for making this program possible. And as always, thank you for stopping by Across the Fence.
For a video copy of today's program, call toll-free 1-888-ATF-3430. Across the Fence is brought to you as a public service by University of Vermont Extension and WCAX TV.